Blender 4.3 is a fantastic release, packed with new and improved features. The developers have clearly put a lot of work into making it robust, capable, and frankly fun to work with. Yet, there are still some everyday frustrations that can slow down your workflow. In this video, we'll look at 10 of these, what I call pain points, the little quirky, clunky, awkward, or counterintuitive behaviors that can be surprisingly irritating when you run into them repeatedly. The goal of this video isn't just to complain, but to hopefully bring some attention to these issues so they can get resolved. The first workflow pain point is one that I've already spoken about, but I'm going to bring it up in this list, and it deals with the bump node's default values. If we want to add a little bit of bump to this material, we would add a bump node to our shader network. I'm going to drive a bitmap into the height, and we look at the default values, which are 1.0. Now, Blender uses a lot of default values that are at 1.0, and so how do you as a user know if this is an appropriate value or not? So let's go ahead and drive this into our normal socket for the material, and you suddenly get something really funky looking on your material. The shading doesn't look right. So you as a user have to figure out what an appropriate value is. In this particular case, it's a very small value like 0.0002 or something in that range. We could maybe even increase it to 0.0005 in order to get the subtlety of the bump map that's appropriate for the object that we're setting up. So this is my complaint, is that the default value for bump is wildly different than what it practically is for a lot of average objects. And I would love to see the default value here be changed to something that's much more common for a broad range of objects, so that especially when users are new, they're not just plugging it in and seeing materials misbehave because of that. The next workflow gotcha deals with the shading editor and how you view the nodes within that shading editor. Currently, the shading editor remembers the view regardless of what the material is. It's always the same. If you switch over from, say, this material setup to the one for this object, the materials are all gone. The nodes are all gone. Well, they're not gone. They're just in a different position, and you're left with trying to figure out how to scroll over and find them. Well, it could have been to the right. It could have been to the left, up and down. To me, this is just a frustration, especially on more complex networks where you've got to hunt and find where that is. Typically, what I do is I press the A key to select all, and then I do a frame selected to bring it into view, but then we're tasked with then zooming down to find the component that you want. And then when I come back to the previous one, everything is just in the same view position as the previous material, and I have to hunt back to where I had previously left it. And what I want to happen is for this view to be tied to each material, so when we switch from material to material to material, the view remains where we had previously left it on a per material basis. The next quirky thing that I would love to see some improvement in is externally linked changes. This falls into two categories. One is changing the name, and the other is changing the contents of the linked file themselves. The way that Blender handles these things is not nearly as efficient and helpful as I think it could be. So let's take a look at an example. I have these three cubes, and these three cubes each has a material. Right now they look the same, but for purposes of this file, I'm going to need to have them each have a unique material, and they're each going to need to have a unique concrete texture. Well, right now the texture is just duplicated 3 times to demonstrate these issues. So if we take a look at this one, I've got material 01, material 02, material 03, and each one of them brings in a bitmap. So let's take a look at this. I have concrete 1, concrete 2, and concrete 3. Again, right now they look the same, but they could be 3 different bitmaps. To help demonstrate how I would like Blender to work, I also have an InDesign file with these 3 same bitmaps imported. The thing that I want to bring your attention to while we're in InDesign is InDesign's link palette. So keep that in the back of your mind. When we jump back over to Blender, we've got the 3 cubes and we've got independent materials, and each of those materials has one of the 3 bitmaps imported, but we've decided that we're going to be importing a whole bunch more concretes, and we need to maintain a naming structure that's logical. So we would come back over and we would need to make a change to our naming convention. So in this case, we would need to come over and add, let's say 01, 02, and then 03. Well, this is very likely something that you're going to end up doing. You're going to end up changing names on files. If we jump back over to InDesign, InDesign immediately detects that a file name has changed, and it allows us to do a relinking so that we can just quickly come over here and relink to the appropriate bitmaps in this palette. And they've all been nicely and neatly organized for us. We don't have to go hunting around the InDesign document to find instances that have been placed and re-import them. So when we jump back over to Blender, Blender hasn't detected that anything has changed. And you're going to note that I'm over here in the blend file. It doesn't indicate here in images that anything has changed. So if we were, let me save this. Let's say I'm opening this file brand new. I'm just going to reopen it up. Now the links are broken. Blender just says they're broken. Can't do anything about it. Gives us a visual indication. But again, when we come over here under images, there's no indication here that these have changed. Well, this is a pretty simple file. I could come back to each of these and I could come back and relink it. I mean, I did that in InDesign, right? But in far more complex files, it's going to be tedious to go hunt down each of your objects just so that you can re-import the images that have changed names. This is an area that I really would love to see improved in Blender. I would love to be able to come over here to images and just have a relink function like we did in InDesign, where it put that little exclamation mark there with a warning symbol next to each of these so that I knew that those had changed. It would be really awesome if it would just automatically pop them up at the top so I could just quickly come over here and see here are the ones that need to relink. The other issue with file handling in Blender, like we demonstrated with a file name change, Blender isn't registering that the file has changed. Modern operating systems, in fact, do have functions and facilities to communicate with applications when files have changed, and obviously InDesign takes advantage of that. But what happens in this case if we decide that we make a change to the bitmap itself? So let's jump over now and see what happens when we don't just change the file name, but we change the contents of the file. So let's jump over to our file list, and I'm going to bring these over into Affinity Photo, and we're going to just make a change to each one of these. The first one I'll rotate by 90 degrees and save and close, and then we will flip horizontally and save, and then finally we will flip vertically and save and close that down. Now, when we come back over to Blender, Blender does not detect that anything has changed because it doesn't see the file. But let's take a look at what I would like to happen when we look at InDesign. InDesign, again, immediately detects that these have changed and it shows a marker on them. But instead of having to go hunt them down in a big file anywhere, they're right here in links, and I simply, in one batch operation, can click this and all 3 get updated. That's what I would like to see happen in Blender. So let's jump over to Blender and let's take a look at what we can do. So we don't have the ability to come over here and do any kind of comparable operation. It doesn't detect that any changes have been made. You could come over in the material editor for each material and do Shift W, bring up Node Wrangler, and then you could say reload images, and it will reload, but it only reloads for the selected material. Okay, so you have to hunt down every object. The other thing is to simply reload the file. So you just simply come over and reload the file, and then it detects the changes because all it's doing is reloading everything that's there. So is that super egregious? No, it's not egregious to do that, but it would really be nice to have much better file handling for changes either to names or to the contents of the files themselves, such as I demonstrated in InDesign. The next quirky item that I'd like to really have worked out has to do with view manipulation, specifically using the lock to 3D cursor function. In Blender, when you select an object, the view pivot will be locked around the center of the object, or if you're in edit mode, then you can have that locked to the selection, the bounds of the selection, or to an element. But sometimes you really want to have that position be locked to a specific location that isn't about a selection. So if I put the 3D cursor right there, I can come over and click the lock to 3D cursor function. This is the first annoyance. A lot of times when you do that, it randomly throws the camera out into some new position. You have to come back down, and then you can manipulate the view as it's locked to the 3D cursor, which allows you to do modeling without changing the view pivot based on the selection. As soon as you finish your modeling operations and you leave edit mode, you want to make sure and turn it off, because if you leave it on, it's going to prevent you from navigating around the rest of the screen. So you go to turn it off, and Blender randomly throws the camera into some location in the scene, and you're left trying to figure out how to get back to where you were or into some rational position in the scene. So as useful as this function is, it's really marred by these odd camera behaviors. What I think needs to happen is that when you use this, it needs to reset the view pivot to remember that location. So when you turn it off, the camera simply stays where it is until you decide to move the camera and reset the view's lock on something else using some other method. The next quirk that I would love to see worked out is one that I run into when I'm doing UV editing, and I also want to display a bitmap relative to my UVs. So you come in and you enable the bitmap, and Blender does that. It radically scales the view so you're suddenly super close in on your UVs. I don't know why that happens, so you got to back out and get back out into a normal view. So you do your editing and then you're done, and you want to turn that off. So you come over here and disable it. And now it has changed the view again so that the UVs have been scaled way down. The UVs themselves aren't being scaled. It's just this display thing. I want the display of the UVs to remain exactly as I had them when I enable and disable the view of a bitmap for reference to the UVs. The next small quirk I would love to be solved is just a user interface thing. If we come over here and want to save this image, we would give it a name. So I'll call this Watch 01. And then we determine we want to change the file format. So you come up and click and nothing happens. So the first click that happens is actually just validating the change that you've made over here. And it's the second click that actually then changes the format. Likewise, if you come over and make a change, and then you come over and try and save, the first click doesn't do anything but validate the change that you've made over here, requiring a second click. And when you're saving a whole bunch of images, all of this double clicking and the lack of validation for what you're actually trying to do with the click is something that really gets to me after a while. The next quirk that I would love to see worked out has to do with the 4 viewport shading icons. In this particular case, we have wireframe, we have shading, and then we have material preview, and then we have a final rendered preview. The rendered preview is great because you can see a preview of what your final ray tracing cycles rendering is going to be. But in this particular case, it doesn't actually show what my final rendering is going to be because it takes into account the visibility of items as they're governed by the screen icon or the eye icon. So when I come over here and turn it on, it's not showing me what my final render is going to be. I've got quite a few particles, and in order to make the scene manageable, I have to disable them inside of the view itself for manageability purposes. But when I come in and do a final cycles rendering, then I get to see all of the components that are governed by the camera icon. So what I really want is for a mode so that the final rendered viewport shading icon will show me what the camera icons are set to so I can see what the full scene is like, not just what the viewport settings are showing me. The next quirk that we're going to talk about is with the particle system. A lot of these things have been sort of average, just little working things that you run into, but this next one dealing with the particle system is actually a little bit mind-blowing to me. I've got two what I'm calling widgets right here. And then I've got a plane that I want to replicate these particles on. So think about the process of creating an outdoor scene where you've got plants and you've got trees and grass and flowers and rocks that you want to propagate across this surface. This is going to impact that. So let's take a look at our objects, the objects that we're going to be propagating. And let's also take a look at the fact that Blender uses Z as the up axis, and that's sort of the key thing to remember right here. If we look at the global coordinate system, we have Z as being up axis, and you can think of Y as sort of being front to back, and then X is sort of left to right. Now, not all 3D applications behave that way. Some use Y as the up axis and Z as the front to back axis. It's just sort of a random thing and you get kind of used to it. If you're coming from an application that uses Y as the up axis, you got to know that in Blender, Z is the up axis. Okay, so we come and we take a look at the fact that my objects were in local transform orientation mode. And this is important to remember. Conform to Blender's standard default up axis. But when you create a particle system, Blender's going to do something weird. So let's just examine something here dealing with assets. Let's come over here to the asset browser. I got some of the botanic assets, plant assets. They're awesome. Let's come down here to a tree and I'm going to take this coniferous tree and I'm going to drag it into the scene. It'll be enormous relative to my scene. But what I want to bring your attention to is, again, we're in local transform, so we can see how the object itself is set up, and it conforms to Blender's convention of Z being the up axis and Y being front, and X you can think of as being left and right. This is very common for most assets you're going to bring in. Let's come back down to our starting point here, and we're going to create a particle system. So we come down and we create a new particle system in hair mode. Let's turn on advanced, so it gives us all of the options. I think advanced should be on by default. We want it to emit from the faces. We're going to turn on rotation, and we're going to come back to this because everything sort of centers around this rotation, but we need to make sure that we're using a collection. I've got a collection called widgets, and there they propagate. But let's come and change the size so that we can actually see these things. Here to render, and let's set this to 0.2, something larger. And you're going to notice something kind of odd happening, and that is that the orientation of these is basically 90 degrees to what you think it should be. Well, if I've got these objects set in sort of a very standard configuration, a very standard way of being placed in the world in terms of something that clearly has an up and down, a top and a bottom and a pointing direction, my particles are not behaving that way. So let's minimize this and come back and take a look at our emitting surface. Let's make sure we change the orientation so that we're going along the normal. So here again, it changes into some random weird way that doesn't make sense logically. Well, I've changed it because I want these particles to conform to the surface. So the normal is the guiding factor here in this particular case. Well, you would think, well, maybe there's something I need to do in terms of rotation. So you would come down to phase, and even phase doesn't really communicate much to the user, but we can rotate phase and you can see it's rotating it, but it's not rotating it around the axis that we want. And if you do phase randomize, so this is something you're going to play with, trying to figure out what's going on. So it turns out the key here is you need to take the asset and you have to rotate it so that Y is the up axis. And this is the thing that I don't get. This is so mystifying to me why it would be engineered this way, to use one of the three axes that you just wouldn't think would be the logical one to use. So let's come over here and we need to come to this little option menu and then affect only the origin, press the R key, and then begin rotating hold the control key to snap and you get to 90 degrees. And now you can see that it's aligning itself along our visual up axis according to the object. Let's do the same thing over here. R key, control to snap, and then we get it behaving the way we want. So you have to do this to every asset that you bring in. You have to reorient its local coordinate system so it conforms to up being the y-axis. And I don't get why it was engineered this way. This completely doesn't make sense to me. And when I first started playing around with the particles, I was really mystified as to what I was seeing, because it just defied the logic of objects being aligned typically to up being the z-axis and then having them lay down on their side. This item has to do with missing functionality that I think should be there as opposed to current functionality that just happens to have some odd behavior to it. We can select a series of items and we can go into isolation mode by pressing the backslash key. That's really helpful for being able to isolate and edit objects separate from everything else. But to my knowledge, Blender doesn't have the ability to remove temporarily transformation that happens to be applied to an object. In this particular case, I have an empty that's parenting a bunch of other objects within sight of that, so that I can control its transformation. And what I really want to happen is to be able to take these objects in isolation and have it temporarily remove the rotation that's applied to that parent empty so I can edit everything in an untransformed state. Then, when I'm done, I would simply return it back to the scene whereby the transformation is re-enabled for that object. I have wanted that so many times, and it would be very, very useful not to have to manually come in and remove it and then reapply that. This last one is admittedly a minor one, but it still drives me nuts every time the user interface does this. You come over to the outliner and you've got an item that you want to rename, and so you double click it so you can rename it, and it jumps away from where you're currently visually focused on so it can put it at the center of the screen. I don't know why, but that just absolutely drives me nuts that it does that. Typically, if I actually have something selected in the main scene itself, I just right-click and rename it over here so I can completely avoid that behavior. But sometimes you need to rename things in the outliner, and I don't want the user interface shifting from underneath my focal point.